the shadow.
Welcome to the interactive draft of Warlock. Warlock didn't get much in the Grand Tournament, and also the meta of Arena got to you need to play cards which are good on curve, so there's not as much opportunity to use life tap, but still, you still have the Warlock ability to, if it does go into the late game, you usually get a pretty big advantage with life tap if you aren't already near death. So I think Warlock's got worse, but they're still viable. This is a reluctant pick of Argent Watchman. Better than the Ancient Watcher because it's not guaranteed that you're going to get something to activate the Watcher, and better than just a 1 mana 1/2 Murloc. Boneguard Lieutenant is pretty good. The bad news for Warlock is that you tend not to want to use your hero power that early. The hero power is more appropriate in the late game. So it turns out that Boneguard Lieutenant, while good, while a great card, is not as good in Warlock. Shield Bearer is garbage. Doesn't do anything. Just gains you 4 health, and board control is what matters in Arena. So Pit Fighter is a nice strong card. Very good stats. Speaking of cards with reasonable stats, I guess Warlock got the Fearsome Doomguard in the Grand Tournament. It's not very exciting, but it's a card, and if you get Void Caller with it, it's quite a good card. It's better than War Golem because of the stats, and I'm gonna pick it because the other 2 cards are bad. Booty Bay Bodyguard and Wisp both have bad stats for their mana cost or aren't worth the card. A lot of these picks so far have just been about stats. This one is going to be similar. They're all 4 mana cards. The Snapjaw is a 2/7, the Refreshment Vendor is a 3/5, the Ancient Brewmaster is a 5/4. Turns out that the 3/5 is arguably better than a 5/4, and Warlocks actually can make use of the health, so the Refreshment Vendor is slightly better. Also, Warlock's Battle Cries tend to not be as good, so the brews are less good in Warlock. This one's a tough pick, but it might not be for the reason that you think. Tiger is a very reasonable card. 5 mana 5/5. It's actually one of the better 5 mana cards out there. Floating Watcher is a card that has a chance of getting really big. Valdir Raider, 5 mana 4/4, is in the Grand Tournament set now, and it is pretty much the same. Of course, with a Floating Watcher, you get a few more opportunities to damage yourself in Warlock. But it turns out that both Valdir Raider and Floating Watcher, I think, tend to be worse than the Stranglethorn Tiger just because the stats when they come out are weaker. What I am considering is also the Mech Warper, since it is a 2 mana 2/3 and I have no 2-drops so far. And the Warlock really wants to get a 2-drop out. Still, I'm just going to pick the Stranglethorn Tiger because of the strength of the card. Though, it is worth mentioning that even though I'm only 5 picks in, I give some slight consideration to the Mech Warper because I don't have any 2-drops. Easy pick based on the stats. The Summoning Portal is a 0/4 for 4 mana. The Lost Tall Strider is a 5/4, which is not very good. Pick the Fen Creeper, even though I already have several 5s. It's the only reasonable card here. Here we've got Bloodsteel Corsair, 1 mana 1/2, which is terrible. The Abomination is actually a card that is reasonable. Though Warlocks tend to be the type of Zooey type of deck in Arena where you just want to play a lot of low cost minions, take advantage of the hero power, and it's all about board control in the early game. So Abomination is less good, but it's not terrible. Shadow Flame, on the other hand, is one of those cards where I can actually catch up and have a few good targets for it. I have some high attack minions. Tends to be good to have that catch-up card. Really happy in this pack to see a good 2-drop. Frigid Snowball is too slow, and there isn't any spell damage here except Shadow Flame. It just turns out spell damage tends to be weak in Arena. Flame Juggler is a really good 2-drop with the added benefit that the 1 damage is actually quite relevant a lot of the times, especially in a class that can't even deal 1 damage by default, so you have the chance to deal 1 damage kind of unexpectedly. The Micro Machine I think is actually weaker than the 3-2. Since the turn you play it, it's only a 2-2 if your opponent can deal with it immediately, and it turns out that a good amount of the time they can. This is actually a little bit of an interesting pick. So first of all, the Blood Imp is actually no good. It's too slow to get going. Perhaps if I had a more aggressive deck, then the Blood Imp would make more sense, but right now I've got a lot of fat cards. And I may be giving the Blood Imp a little too little of credit. If you get turn 1 Blood Imp and then you curve into 2, 3, 4, etc., it's actually really good for you. That said though, right now, the deck is looking a little dodgy for Blood Imp. So it's between Pit Fighter and Power Overwhelming, and Pit Fighter is a great card, but I already have 3 5s, and Power Overwhelming is also a pretty good card. I don't have much early game. And also Pit Fighter tends to be better than Power Overwhelming. Power Overwhelming does have the synergy here with Shadow Flame, and I do have reasons not to choose Pit Fighter because I already have 3 5-drops. That said, though, I am still going to pick I'm still going to pick Pit Fighter just because the card is so good as a 5-mana 5/6. But this is actually really close, I'm going to admit. And I actually would not blame anyone for picking the Power Overwhelming here. Might even be better. It's really close. This is an easy pick. I've got a 5-mana 1/5, a 6-mana 6/5 in the late game where your hero power is actually the best, so you wouldn't even want to sideshow Spell Eater. So just pick the 2-mana 3/2. A simple pick here as well. 4-mana 2/6, 5-mana 5/4. There's no dragon, so you pick the 3-mana 3/3, which is fine to play on turn 3. You can also play it on turn 5. I think I'll be playing this on turn 3 quite a bit, since I have several 5s. And in the late game, it's an engine. We are looking for more early games, so I'm happy to see 2-mana 2/3s here. Obviously, you don't pick the Crocolisk because the Trog is strictly better. And then we have enough late game already. We actually might even have enough late game, period. Especially in Warlock, where you can just use your hero power, and you can focus a bit more on early game. The Clockwork Gnome is actually reasonable in Warlock because of the hero power. So usually in classes, the Clockwork Gnome isn't good enough because cards are precious, and a 1-mana 2/1 isn't good enough, though still the Clockwork Gnome does give you a spare part at least. In Warlock it's a little bit more okay, because you can just replace the cards for 2 mana. That said though, it's still not that good a card, and I much prefer the bulky Ogre, and I don't have any 6-drops yet. Flesh-Eating Ghoul I actually think is worse than Clockwork Gnome here. Flesh-Eating Ghoul is a reasonable card if you have a lot of early game though. Thearism Doomguard is a 7-drop, and I already have a 7-drop, and if you pick too much late game, you're just going to lose because you get out-tempoed too early. The reason why I thought it was interesting is because Noyatron is probably the best card here by default, and I already have 1, 2, 3, 4 2-drops, and in a Warlock deck I'd probably want something like 8 2-drops, just because it's really important to get 2-drops going on turn 2, so you want to have a good chance of doing that. And if I were to pick the Annoyatron, that would put me above average in the number of 2-drops. But when you're a Warlock, you can actually get a lot of 2-drops, like even 10, and it wouldn't be ridiculous because your hero power lets you replenish. So it's going to be Annoyatron over the Dark Scale Healer. Dark Scale Healer isn't bad, especially in Warlock, since the healing is good. Also, I have a lot of tough guys, Pit Fighters, Tigers, Ogres, Doom Guards, Fen Creepers. All of these guys have a good chance of getting healed by the healer. But I already have several 5s, so I'm going to choose Annoyatron, even though I already have several 2s. I'm quite happy to see the card I'm going to pick here. It won't be Voodoo Doctor because it's simply a 1-mana 2/1, though the Restore 2 health is useful. Shroud Sun Cleric is going to be the pick here. I have very few 3s. I have a lot of 2s. And more importantly, a lot of these 2s are 2/3s or Annoyatron, and those are really good targets for Shroud Sun Cleric. You play your 2-mana 2/3, they play their 2-mana 3/2 or 2/3, and then you play Shroud Sun Cleric, and then you get to trade up and have your guy still survive. It's a big deal. Direwolf Alpha, similar to Constructed Zoo, is better in decks with a lot of early game, and turns out that Direwolf Alpha would actually be a very good pick here too, but Shroud Sun Cleric is better. This one's easy. You have your 6-mana 4/5, you have your 4-mana 2/6, and you have your 4-mana 4/3 with a useful ability. So you pick the Spellbreaker. The Antique Killbot is better by quite a bit in the Warlock, just because given a long enough time frame, the Antique Killbot actually draws you 4 cards if you are worried about your life total. That said, though, there's a much better card in here, and it's not War Golem, which is just a 7-mana 7/7, which there's no need for in this deck. This deck already has all the late game at once. Mortal Coil is really, really good. It's deceptively good, I'd say. It may look very small, it's just 1 mana, deal 1 damage, but against the Warlock, many players will leave their stuff at 1 damage, knowing that Warlock players don't have a way to deal 1 damage easily. So oftentimes you're going to have that opponent with the 5/1, and you're just going to have no answer. You have to play something like a 3/5 into it, and it feels really bad. But instead, you kill it for 1 mana, and you draw a card, and Mortal Coil is just really good. This one's a little bit of an interesting pick in that I would consider Scarlet Crusader and Silverhand Regent to be around the same power level, but given that there's been this theme of I already have enough late game, the Silverhand Regent is less good than the Scarlet Crusader, which I want to dominate the early game with. The Stormpike Commando is a card which is subpar just because of its stats, and also I have so many 5-drops, you wouldn't even consider the Stormpike Commando anyways. What might be an interesting question is just how many Mortal Coils is too many Mortal Coils? And I think the answer to that question might be somewhere around 4. Which is to say I love Mortal Coil, and I would pick like 4 of them pretty happily. Though I have to admit there's some diminishing returns, because if you have a handful of Mortal Coils, your hand is useless. So maybe 3 would be... No, I would probably start considering Mortal Coil to be less good of a card at 2, but I would still think of it as a pretty good card. So that said, the competition is a 3-mana 3/3 or a 1-mana 2/1. Of course you pick Mortal Coil here. Okay, this pick is pretty tough. The 2 cards that are being considered are Arcane Nullifier and Fell Cannon. So the pro of Arcane Nullifier is that it's a very resilient taunt, and it is useful for Warlocks to have some amount of taunt because they tend to go a little bit lower in health total due to the natural Warlock mechanic of life tapping. Fell Cannon is a deceptively strong card. First of all, it is a 4 mana 3/5, but perhaps more importantly, you can choose when to play it, and if you play it when the opponent has exactly a 2 health minion on the board, which is something that happens a good amount of times, your Fell Cannon gets a lot of value. Furthermore, if you play the Fell Cannon in response, let's say there's an empty board, your opponent plays like a 4 mana 3/5 or a 4 mana 4/5. You play the Fell Cannon, then they have a 4 mana 3/3 or 4 mana 4/3, which your Fell Cannon can beat. So, Fell Cannon's really good when you have no board. Basically, it's better when it's about even or when you're losing slightly. And if you're winning, then you can always just tap and then play a smaller card. A reason to play Arcane Nullifier would be, say I didn't have very many taunts in the deck, then I would pick Arcane Nullifier, since just having some taunt is nice and flexible. But I already have an Anoitron and I have a Fen Creeper, so I'm kind of feeling good about my taunts. The stats of the Arcane Nullifier aren't that strong, and you mainly get it for the utility of it, and I argue I have enough utility, so I want to play the stronger card. So I'll pick Fell Cannon. I've talked a lot about these two cards, and I haven't talked about Void Terror. Void Terror is actually worse, I think, in general, than a 3 mana 3/3, because often you're going to want to have more minions on the board, and it's tough to find a spot to eat your own stuff and have it be good. So, Fell Cannon it is. This pick's easy. You have one of the best cards in Warlock. And it's not Ice Rager and it's not Bloodsteel Raider, which are just 3 mana 5/2s or 2 mana 2/3s. Imp Gang Boss is really good. So, I actually think in the common spot, whenever you see Imp Gang Boss, you just pick Imp Gang Boss. It's pretty easy. We don't have that many 4-drops, first of all. So, Shadow Flame doesn't count as a 4-drop, so there's Fell Cannon, Refreshment Vendor, and Spellbreaker. So, the Maiden of the Lake would be a card that you would kind of want to pick. Just because I think it's a fairly good 4-drop. Your hero power is pretty flexible in this one. But that said, that's ignoring the fact that there's 2 other really good cards in the deck, in this pick. The Spider Tank is really good. It's just a 3 mana 3/4. That's really good stats. And the Flame Juggler is the 2 mana 2/3 with an added bonus, and that's also really good. So you kind of really focus on curve in this pick. And curve-wise, 4 3-drops seems reasonable. It's like above average and where we are right now. And 2-drops, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And like I said, I want to be at somewhere around 8. So picking a really good 2-drop is going to be more important than picking a really good 3-drop here, I'd say. And also, it kind of serves as a 4-drop to some extent, because you can always, as a hero, as a Warlock, you can hero power and then play a 2-drop. So here I take a quick look at my curve before deciding whether or not I want to pick another 2-drop over a late game card. And I look and I'm like, right, we're still in the same case where I already have 5 big late game cards, 2 Pit Fighters, a Tiger, an Ogre, and a Doomguard, and that's pretty much what I wanted, so I would only pick a big card if it were really good, and Valdir Raider is not that good. So it becomes a choice between Lance Carrier and Youthful Brewmaster, and given the likelihood that I will have the board in the earlier game, Lance Carrier is pretty good. And there's nothing really that Youthful Brewmaster wants to return that much. I do have 2 Flame Jugglers and Recombobulator, and that's fun, and a Shattered Sun Cleric, and a Spellbreaker. And I have big cards that could be healed. And I'm starting to convince myself that Brewmaster might be better. Alright, well, after all, I'll just go for the Brewmaster because I had an unexpectedly large amount of useful battle cries in a Warlock deck, which I usually don't see, but in this case, I happen to have it. It also has the benefit over the Lance Carrier of being a card that you actually want to play on turn 2, because it's just a 2 mana 3/2. And when I look at the curve, I actually have quite a few 2-drops that I don't want to play on turn 2. Like Argent Watchman is not something that you're very excited about. Flame Juggler would better be saved. Recombobulator would also better be saved. That said, if you have these on turn 2, you still play them. So when you think about like the optimal cards you would play on turn 2, they just are Annoytron or Stone Splinter Trog, and the other 4 all have some small utility or are better played on a different turn. So I'll choose Youthful. We do a quick deck check to see whether or not Sense Demons makes any sense. There's Imp Gang Boss and Fearsome Doomguard. So with only 2 demons in the deck, there's a good amount of times where you might just draw one and then whiff, and then the Sense Demons is useless. So better to just play a 2 mana 4/3. This card's actually pretty good. And that does also make 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is the 8th 2-drop, which I am perfectly happy with. I would even pick more 2-drops if they were high quality enough. And there's a Demon Fuse. We won't even worry about this card. This card doesn't exist. Some say that the Tiger and the Spectral Knight are around the same power level, but I myself value the Tiger more. I think the 4/6 stats are slightly better, but when it comes to being able to be the one to dictate where the Tiger goes, the Tiger is better. It does survive all the AoE pretty much, all the AoE being like Flame Strike. And since you get the first attack with Tiger, usually the 5 health is fine. So I would pick Tiger over Spectral Knight. The question then is whether or not you pick Soulfire. And the Soulfire is not that bad. It's a card that obviously does a lot for its mana cost. Only 1 mana to deal 4 damage. The drawback is really heavy, but you are a Warlock and you get to tap to replenish, so you can think of it as 3 mana, deal 4 damage sometimes, since you can use it alongside tapping. So you look at your curve and you're like, oh, I already have 4 or 5 drops. Could use something to be able to flatten the curve some more, because having a 1-drop that can flexibly just gain a lot of tempo can be really important in the early game. And it is a fast card, so the concept of fast cards versus slow cards I found is pretty important. Like, you want to have some amount of fast cards so that you can... Sometimes you really need to just get something done immediately. So what are the fast cards in this deck? There's Coil, which is really situational of a fast card. There's Flame Juggler, which is a really situational fast card. There's Shadow Flame, which... So when you look at this deck, it's actually a lot of slow cards. Like, they're all minions which take a turn to get ready, or require you to already have a setup, like Shattered Sun Cleric. So I am going to pick the Soulfire here. I think it's a bit of a tough choice. There was a time when I wasn't that concerned about tempo or like worried about getting enough fast cards in your deck, but I've come around to it, and I've lost a lot of arenas because I only had slow cards in my deck. And I think this Soulfire is very often going to be used when you do have cards in your hand. Of course, there's the good old trick of you wait until the late game to use the Soulfire, and then you don't discard a random card, and it's just really efficient. But just having the tempo, I think, is very useful here. So I'm going to pick the Soulfire over 2 really good cards. And that's not to say the Soulfire is a bad card. The Soulfire is also a good card. But it's about equal, and in this deck, since I already have the 5s, I'm going to pick the Soulfire. So it turns out that I really wasn't kidding when I said earlier that we already have enough late game. I just picked Soulfire, and I do have a lot of 2-drops, right? Annoytron, Watchman, 2 Juggler, Recombobulator, Stone Splinter Trog, Wrathguard, Youthful Brewmaster. That's 8. But I make the argument that you can just pick a lot of 2-drops in Warlock. You really want to gain that board, and I will pick that over the slow cards and the late game cards, the Fearsome Doomguard and Lord of the Arena. Because really the style of Warlock that you kind of want is you gain control of the board and then you can use your life total really available to just draw cards in the late game. Because if you control the board, the Warlock hero power is one of the strongest around. Let's use the Lance Carrier here. Usually in Warlock you don't have very many low cost spells, so the teacher isn't as valuable, even though it is a 3/5, which is fine. But here I actually have 2 Mortal Quills and a Soulfire, so it's nice to have the low cost spells. There's not that many spells in the deck, only the 2 Mortal Quill and a Shadow Flame, and the Soulfire, which is to be expected. In arenas, there's not that many spells going around. That said, given that the 4-drop is a spot that I don't have very many cards in, and the Violet Teacher happens to be even better in this arena, it's an easy pick, especially since the other 2 cards are bad. I don't want to just broadly say that, though. The Arcane Golem isn't that bad. It's like generally okay. You have to play it at the right time, though, and the Argent Watchman is too slow. So speaking of controlling the early game, Worgen Infiltrator is really good at it. It does only have 1 health, but because of the stealth you get to choose how to trade into it. And as a Warlock, just picking a lot of early game and then tapping in the later game to make up for you playing a lot of cards in the early game is fine. It's even easier of a choice because the other 2 cards are bad. But Worgen Infiltrator is actually a great card here, and I would pick it rather highly. Probably only second to Zombie Chat, which I would pick really highly. Raid Leader just has bad stats, so does Silverman Guardian. Alright, at this point, you might think, there's too much early game. You've got Worgen Infiltrator, Noitron, Argent Watchman, 2 Juggler, Carrier, Recombobulator, Trog, Wrathguard, Brewmaster. That's like 10 early game cards, and you even have 2 Coil and a Soulfire. But it just turns out that it's so very important to gain control of that early game that I will pick another 2-drop here. The decision is made easier because the 2 cards surrounding it are bad, but Flame Juggler is so good. Maybe a better puzzle would be to think, like, what cards would I pick over Flame Juggler here? I'd pick Imp Gang Boss, I'd pick Piloted Shredder, I'd pick any of the Yeti-like cards, since there's a light amount of 4s here, but there's not that many cards I'd pick over like a Flame Juggler, even though it looks like I have a ridiculous number of 2s. Warlock is that one class where you can forget the usual, okay, I only want like 8 maximum 2-drop rules. As a Warlock, you can just pick however much early game you want. So this final pick is disappointing. You look at the spells, and there are only 4 spells in the deck, the 2 Coil, the Soulfire, and the Shadow Flame. So you don't really want the Gnomish Experimenter that much, since it's very often going to be a chicken. That said, though, it might be better than the other cards. Target Dummy is obviously not going to be even worth a consideration, because it's really bad. Even in Warlock, you can tap to regain the cards. You still wouldn't play a 2-mana 0/2 draw a card. And the Ancient Mage is worth considering a little bit, just because I do have 2 Coils, and the plan is to get the early game. Like, the Ancient Mage actually hits 4 things here, which is exceptional for a Warlock. It's really rare for that to happen. Plus, spell damage plus Mortal Coil happens to be one of the better things you can put the spell damage on. Like, spell damage on the cheap spells makes a lot of sense. Even with all that said, though, I'm not sure whether or not the Gnomish Experimenter is worse or better than the Ancient Mage. You do have to consider that in this deck, there's almost nothing that you would mind too much about turning into a chicken. So it's 3 mana 3/2 or 4 mana 3/2 plus a 1/1. That's obviously bad. But you compare it with the 4 mana 2/5, which is obviously bad as well. I think in this deck, given that there is the 2 Coils and that you do have a lot of floody minions, so you are likelier to have adjacent minions, it's a slight nod towards the Ancient Mage, but I want to preface this by just saying how much I loathe picking the Ancient Mage because its stats are so poor. It's like you have the 4 mana 3/2 plus 1/1, which is 4/3 in stats, or you have the 4 mana 2/5. Both have a very slight benefit. You do have that 4 spells you could draw with Experimenter, and you only have 4 spells you're doing with the Ancient Mage. It's really close. I think the tiebreaker ends up being I have enough 3s and not as many 4s as I usually have. But then again, I have so many 2s that they are kind of 4s. I think this is just really close and you can pick either. A lot of people are surprised by how agonizing this pick is. It's like, you only have 4 spells, of course you choose the Ancient Mage over the Gnomish Experimenter. But there aren't that many spells out there, and destroying a card is really, really, really unimportant. Like, I can't emphasize enough how unimportant that is. It's more of, think of it as the bonus that some very, very small amount of time you're going to draw a actual spell with it, and then it's huge. Because you want to destroy your cards in order to put 1/1 chickens in your hand. If you could voluntarily destroy cards to put chickens in your hand, good players would do that all the time. And then you would be able to curve out perfectly with chickens, and it would be a really big advantage. That said, I'm going to pick the Ancient Mage here. I think it's really close. I wouldn't blame anyone for picking the Experimenter. I think it's too close to call. And a really, really small reason also to not worry about my 3-drop slot is that I have 2 coils, so that I can play a 2-drop and coil often on 3. So, yeah. So close. So, this deck is obviously really focused on the early game, having Worgen Infiltrator, Neurotron, Argent Watchman, 3 Jugglers, Landscarer, Recombibular, Stone Splinter Trog, Wrathguard, Youthful Brewmaster for 11 cards you can play as minions, and then you combine with the Soulfire and the 2 Mortal Coils, and that's like 14 cards that are 2 mana and under. That might seem like a lot, but surprisingly there's a good amount of late game also. And it was with picking the good late game cards early that I managed to have the confidence to just pick so many earlier game cards. The game plan for this deck is really simple. You gain control of the board early, and then in the later game you tap and then you play a card. You tap and then you play 2 cards to make maximum advantage of that Warlock advantage. This is actually a good deck because there are a lot of high quality cards here, notably 3 Flame Jugglers and 2 Mortal Coils. That's going to really help out with the Warlock weakness of not being able to deal 1 damage. And with so many 2-drops, I think this deck will be fairly consistent in capturing the early game, and then it has good 3-drops to follow it up. The 4-drop slot is the weak point of this deck, with only featuring cards like Ancient Mage and Fell Cannon, and just cards that aren't the strongest that they could be, like 4 5s. We only have 3 5s and 2 5s. Deck picks up a bit in the late game with just really strong 5 6s, 6 7s, 6 8s. So yeah, it's for a Warlock deck, I think this is quite good. I'm gonna guess 10.